Good afternoon. My name is Jim Conlan, and welcome back to this latest edition of the Sports Show RCB Sport. And this month we've been looking at iconic people in the world of the sports entertainment. Last week our guest was the one and only Carlos Colon Jr., who played the role of Carlito in the WWE. And this week I'm delighted to be joined by the one and only PJ Polaco. You might remember him most famously for his role as Justin Incredible in the time in ECW, and he has also appeared in that historic period during the WWE, the invasion, where WCW and WWF came to the forefront. But PJ, I just want to bring you back to your early childhood and growing up as a kid. Were you an athletic type growing up in the States? Was it ice hockey? Was it basketball, American football? How did a young PJ Polaco get an interest in wrestling? Was it from watching Hulk Hogan or Andre the Giant growing up, or how did you become a fan?
Well, first of all, my folks are Portuguese. I'm Portuguese. They
Okay.
came over from Portugal in 1970. So football, we call it soccer, but in my house, it was always football as well. So we watched a lot of football. And my dad really started to love basketball when he came to America. So we watched a lot of, the Boston Celtics in the 80s, which was that really famous period in basketball. But other than that, I grew up watching, Hulk Hogan because I live near New York City, about an hour from New York, and that was the promotion. So we would get a lot of WWF at the time, and when I saw Hulk Hogan, I remember going to a cafe because pay-per-view, you had, not everybody had it in those days, to watch Hulk slam Andre. It was that really as a fan is what I started watching.
And were you the athletic sort of type, PJ, growing up as a teenager? Were you heavily involved in playing all types of sports, or what was your sort of, were you studious, or what was your type of background as a teen, or your upbringing? Did you have a fairly civilized upbringing as a teenager?
I did. I went to Catholic school my whole life, kindergarten through high school. I went to St. Mary's, which is, for us, our schooling is kindergarten through eighth grade. And then for high school, I went to Holy Cross, which is like, I don't know how you guys do it over there, but, 4 years, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior years. I graduated Holy Cross High School, which is a prestigious school. In 1991, I played football, aka soccer, and I played baseball as well.
Okay.
But I wasn't great at them. I was good enough to make the team, but I wasn't a star. I wasn't in the starting lineup, let's say.
And PJ, in terms of going to Alberta in 1992, where did you come around? You mentioned there graduating from high school. So
Mhm.
was it your parents' ambition that you go on to college and pursue a sort of a third degree? And how did a flip come that you wound up in the Harts Brothers camp in Alberta in 1992? You said you graduated in 1991.
Yes.
So there must have been a massive sort of chain of events, or in terms of, for such a scenario like that to happen.
Yeah, very much so. My mom and dad really wanted me to go to college, university, which was, looking back, probably would have been the smart thing. I wish I would have. My son is 1 year from graduating university, so I'm very proud of him. I wish I would have, only because, I wasn't thinking. You always think as a young man that it lasts forever. And I wish I would have had some studies in my background, but the change happened. I was working. I figured I would take a year off because really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Like I said, I graduated when I was 17. So I took a full year just to work. I worked at a grocery store, bagging groceries, stocking the shelves. And one day on my lunch break, I was back then, this was pre-internet, and stuff like that. I went to I grabbed a soda and I went to the magazine, the magazine stand where they had all the magazines, and I was looking. I love wrestling, so I was looking at the wrestling magazines and flipping through the pages. I think it was like a Pro Wrestling Illustrated. There was a full one-page advertisement for, and I'll never forget it. And Jericho says the same thing because Chris and Lance Lance Storm, who come into my career later on. But they came through the same thing. We all found this wonderful advertisement that said, "Dare to be great. World famous Hart Brothers professional wrestling camp." And back then, kayfabe was still very much a thing. The business was not as exposed, obviously, as it is today. So I'd always thought about it, but I never knew how. And in this advertisement in the wrestling magazine, there was a phone number to call and talk to someone. So I bought the magazine, came home, I called, I spoke to Bruce Hart, I think is one of the older brothers, older than Brett by a little bit, but and, he explained the situation, and I think it was like $2,500 for 2 months of training. And I would live up there and such. And one of the reasons I went up there was because I was very familiar with the Hearts and the dungeon and all of that. It was very famous. But number two, I didn't know anybody else. I didn't know how to, even though I live near New York City, I didn't know there were good wrestling schools in New York. If I did, I would have taken probably a much different path. I don't regret it. It probably helped make my career. And during this conversation, I'll probably tell you a couple of stories of how it helped my career. But it was because of that that I went. So I saved up a little bit of money. And I worked, and I think Lance and I spoke, I think July 3rd, I landed in Calgary to train to be a professional wrestler.
Yeah, and you mentioned arriving in Calgary. I suppose you're leaving New York, obviously,
Yes.
which is on the east coast of America.
Yeah.
You're going all the way up to Calgary, packing your bags. I suppose you don't know anyone there. I suppose
Nobody.
It's a shot in the dark, really, in terms of how it will go, and in terms of your experiences. A weekend, you might actually find that you hate the thing, and all the money that you spend is gone up in the drain. So, was it, in terms of taking that big risk, did you talk it over with anyone, or was it just something that you were saying, I'm just determined, I'm going to see how this plays out. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't, and I'll go home with no regrets?
Yeah, I really didn't have anybody to talk to other than my mates at home, that loved wrestling as well. We would go to shows together, at home when we were in school. But yeah, I didn't know anybody from the business. I was a complete mark. I mean, I used to wrestle in the backyard, so, and I was quite good. So, I mean, I knew how to sell, because if you watch wrestling and because I used to get the dirt sheets, I used to get Meltzer's newsletter, and I was, plugged in that way. So I would read it and watch it differently. I watched it from even when I was younger, I watched it from, how do I do that? What are they doing? Because I had a good athletic background. So I was looking at it like, how are they performing this, right? How are they? So like when I got there, I remember the first day at the Hart camp, we all set up the ring, and the ring would stay there because it was in one facility. It would stay there for 2 months. Where we set it up. It wasn't in the dungeon, like a lot of people may think. They rented a place that we would go to, although I have gone to the dungeon. But at this point, the camp had gotten much bigger. They needed to rent out a facility. So day one, we set the ring up, and then without permission, I got in the ring with one of the other kids that kind of knew what he was doing too. And we were already trying high spots and sunset flips. And, I was already kind of, I was a good imitator. If I saw it, I could imitate it. So I was a quick learner. I really, I learned, the Hearts really helped me with how to do it correctly, the proper way to grab a headlock, to work the left arm, certain rules, and how to protect yourself with bumps and so forth. So, but it was great, man. It was a very amazing, yet very difficult experience. I'm a young man. I'm out of the country, and if you know anything about the map, the U.S. map. We're on the East Coast, and it's the Atlantic Ocean. We're 5 hours, we're right across the pond from you guys, really. Yeah. And Alberta is all the way west, almost like, it's so far away, and it's so cold and so different than anything I'm used to. And I'd only ever gone out of the country with my folks to Portugal. And so I'd never really gone alone anywhere. So, it was scary. It was very scary.
And PJ, in terms of that Hart experience there. Was that very much, did you have to have a high level of fitness to withstand that sort of camp? Was it like a boot camp in terms of endurance, in terms of physique? If was there people at the time that sort of paid up a membership and it just couldn't last it out? It just broke
Yes.
them psychologically and mentally, that they couldn't just hack it? Was it really, did you have to have a high level of fitness and endurance to get through that?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. You could certainly, they weren't going to kick you out themselves. If you paid, you were there for the whole thing. But every day we worked out Monday. This was a unique camp. I don't think a lot of people do it like this anymore. It was Monday through Friday. We worked for 2 hours in the evening. Let's say like maybe 6 or 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And so it's Monday through Friday, and then they'd give us Saturday and Sundays off. And we were only there for 8 weeks. That was the duration. And after the 8 weeks, you were done. You should be trained fully to wrestle. So yeah, they would make you do, even before you got in the ring, 500 squats in the middle of the ring, all kinds of push-ups, sit-ups, and you would jog 2 miles every day before you even got in the ring. Wow. So it really prepared you, physically. I thought I was in good shape, and I was, all muscle. I was a young kid, full of piss and vinegar. And, but when I started doing the cardiovascular stuff, I realized, wow, it's a lot more than just looking the part. It's about being in wrestling shape, which I come to find later was much more important than the muscles, although muscles look great. I mean, it's great to look good, don't get me wrong, but it was a whole different kind of conditioning that neither I nor anybody in that camp was really ready for. But yeah, it was intense.
And PJ, you mentioned there quickly, you mentioned Lance and Chris, and
Yes.
you mentioned they came into your career from an early stage. When was the first time maybe that you came across Chris Jericho? Was it back then, very, very early on in terms of that? And did you strike it off straight away?
I met Chris probably 2 or 3 weeks during the camp. Okay. What a lot of people sometimes don't know is Lance and Chris came in on the previous camp. So Lance Storm was the guy that the Harts brought in to do a lot of the training. So in essence, yes, I was at the Hart Brothers camp, and Keith Hart, who was the main trainer, would get in the ring every so often to show you a couple of moves. But reality, it was Lance in the ring all the time doing the work, where maybe Keith would be on the outside, say, yeah, that was good, that was not so good. But Lance was the one physically in there. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So realistically, a lot of the time, if not 80% of the time, Lance Storm really was the one that trained me under the Hart Brothers name,
And PJ, in terms of your first spell in professional wrestling, in terms of, was with the WWF, and you mentioned your Portuguese intensity there, and you sort of the role of Aldo Montoya. And tell me, when you signed on, first of all, was that your idea, or with speaking to the writers, was it a sort of a gimmick that they had in mind in terms of portraying this sort of Spanish type, Basque type, or Portuguese type character in terms of that?
Well, it was very strange, and I'll get through it as quickly as I can. But it's a fascinating story. I was working as enhancement talent, aka I was a jobber. I was doing it for a year or so. Started in '93, where I simply showed up at a house show near my hometown. And one of the agents at the time was very gracious. I told him I was a wrestler, and I asked if they needed any help, any talent. He said no, they were all set. But I said I was trained by the Harts, and Brett and Owen were both with the WWF at the time. So that really got my foot in the door. So at the end of that day, they gave me a card and said, look, we're starting a brand new show called Monday Night Raw. We're going to need some extras. If you want to do it, we would be glad to use you. And that's how I started my relationship with them. Fast forward about a year, I'm from Connecticut. The office, the WWE office, WWF office at the time, was in Connecticut, still is. I live about 40 minutes from the office. So Undertaker was doing that angle, I'm sure you remember, with the double Undertakers.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
The office had me come in to work with Mark and the other Undertaker, aka Brian Lee, kind of to help him imitate Taker. Like I was just the bump. I was the bump dummy for them. But the cool thing was we worked Monday through Friday. On Friday, we were going to do a dress rehearsal for Vince and Pat Patterson, Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson. And then I was to wrestle them Monday, wrestle Brian Lee as the Undertaker, the Faker Taker, on Raw next week. Okay. So we worked all week. I get this dress rehearsal with Vince and Pat. So after the dress rehearsal, Pat gets in the ring and he's talking to me. He's like, "Hey kid, you're pretty good, you know. What's your nationality?" I said, "I'm Portuguese, sir." He goes, "Hey Vince," you know, in his Montreal Canadian accent, "This kid here, he's Portuguese." And Vince kind of pops. And I'm like, "Okay, what's that about?" I'm okay, you know, no big deal. I don't know if he had a thing for Portuguese, whatever, I don't know. And then Pat keeps going on. He likes my work. And he goes, "Do you speak Portuguese, kid?" I said, "Yes, sir, I do." "Hey, Vince, this kid speaks Portuguese." And Vince goes, "Ha, very good." The whole time they were looking for a Portuguese speaking wrestler to go to Brazil, because in Brazil, that's the main language of Portuguese. And also in Europe to, you know, because back then business was bad in the States. So Davy Boy was huge over in Europe, especially in England and that area. And so they wanted to do that with other wrestlers. Like Davy would have England, I would have Brazil and Portugal. They had some other, you know, French, Canadian, Italian guys. So that was the plan for overseas touring. And Aldo Montoya, the Portuguese man of war, was originally a soccer player, a football player. Because the first drawing of the character, it was around time of the World Cup in that year. I was number 24 with long hair and a football outfit with the ball and everything. They changed it last minute into more of a Power Ranger sort of thing, but they wrote up all of it. Their creative department, you know, came up with that. I never had any real say, but it's kind of funny now looking back, you know.
And your first time experience in the WWF, you were there for the best part of 3 years before you went to ECW. Yes. But getting to fight your very first match, you mentioned being a jobber, but you got in the ring you got a match up with the likes of Lex Luger at the time, a few sort of wrestlers like that. In terms of coming out of that experience, I know you probably would have liked maybe a better sort of stint or a better character, a better direction. But was it a great sort of learning curve in terms of going into the next industry? Did it give you a sort of heads up what you were facing before you joined ECW?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons that Vince put the mask on me, because he understood back then Vince had a lot more personal relationships with the guys and the gals than he does today. So I worked very closely with Vince, and I think the whole thing was, this is going to be a startup character, because I was 23 years old when I was Aldo. I was barely in the business 2 years. You know, there was no NXT or anything like that. So I got thrust right in. You know what I mean? I'm 23 years old. Aldo Montoya is wrestling Madison Square Garden. You know, it was pretty cool. And I think the whole time was Vince wanted me in the WWE one way or another. Even in ECW, which I came to find out later was already being kind of paid for by Vince, because Paulie later admitted that Vince was helping the whole time, funding ECW. So I think the idea was to get some experience, work as Aldo, learn the ropes. I mean, I traveled the world over many times as Aldo, got to work hundreds and hundreds of matches against some of the greatest of all time. You know, I worked with Taker, I worked with Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon. Kurt Hennig, Mr. Perfect, so many. I mean, I could go on and on, dude. It was so cool. And I learned so much that when I finally became just incredible, I was ready. You know, I was ready to really be that star. You know what I mean?
And I suppose in terms of, I've spoken to Devin Hughes in the past, and I've spoken to Rob Van Dam, and they told me about their time coming to ECW, the influence of Paulie Heyman, and Paulie, they call him the brains of the business. They tell him that the guy, his mind for wrestling is probably one of the the best you'll ever meet in terms of characters and sort of things like that. Was that your own experience with Paul Heyman in terms of direction, in terms of ECW? Do you credit Paul for a bit of your character as well for making the Just Incredible character?
I do. I certainly agree with that. That he is a great mind and a great understanding for this business. And but one thing I don't think a lot of people give him credit for, but he's a great motivator. And although he is an amazing idea man and a great booker and a lot of other great things, but one of the best things he ever did was create confidence in you. Like he would have talks with me, and sometimes before a show he would have me in his room. We'd smoke some pot and be in his room talking about the next night's big show at the arena, at the ECW arena. And his greatest thing was giving us, the performer, the confidence and to succeed, and also getting out of our way to let us experiment. That was his great thing, because he wasn't such a control freak. Like what I hear today is from the WWE wrestlers is it's so micromanaged that the guys and the gals really don't have a lot of input, which really hurts. And where the genius of Paul was, he would tell you, this is the picture I want to paint. This is what I want from you. It's you and your how to get there. So really, Paul's greatest thing was he was a great collaborator. He would come up with the big idea, and and then you as the performer figure it out how to get there. So it was like, what I'm saying? It was like a good collaboration, and he made you feel like you were the most. And it's a skill, because he's such a great talker and motivator. He would make you feel like you could run through a brick wall, and you believed it, because he was just so charismatic, and he gave you that confidence. And I think that's why so many people loved working for him. He was just so passionate and made you feel good. And that's a great thing, and a great thing about human beings. If you make them feel good and you tell them, look, man, you're good at what you do, you have what it takes. Guys, especially in this business, in wrestling or in entertainment or in sport, you need to hear that positive reinforcement, because then it clicks that little, what I mean? That little thing that and you start to think, because it is, a lot of it is you're battling yourself. Am I good enough? Do I have what it takes? And he was always there to help bring that out of you. So I think that was part of his genius that never gets talked about enough. He was a great manager of people. He was a good leader of people, by letting you be yourself, and giving you confidence.
Yeah. And PJ, in terms of, there's so many wrestlers in today's sort of modern world, they'll wrestle the WWE or they'll wrestle in terms of TNA. But if you mention anything about ultra violence or anything about CZW, say, oh no, not for me, sort of scenario like that, not getting into that sort of world. Well, you came out of the WWF in 1997. I suppose ECW had been around for maybe a year or two at that sort of stage. Obviously, you knew what the product was about in terms of signing up for it. You probably knew that in terms of the recovery and the stuff that you might have to do might be a bit different in terms of dealing with some of the matches involve fire, some of them involve baseball bats, tacks, glass, things that weren't being done in the WWF for anywhere about that time. And you probably have your sort of coming from that background, coming in and then going into ECW. Were you a bit conscious in the same way to say, this is not the wrestling that I'm sort of familiar with as well, and there might be people coming from that ultra violent sort of thing, and how am I going to cooperate and work with them?
I was very nervous. Yes, I had seen and heard the rumors, and I'd never watched it. I'd just seen clips and and stuff like that. But yeah, I was scared. I would, to be honest. But Chris Candido, who was very instrumental coming to ECW, was he's like, look, ECW is not what you think. It's because I worked with him a lot when he was Skip from with the Body Donnas, you know, and he was working for Paul as one of his bookers, one of his assistants. And he said, look, man, Paul wants not just hardcore stuff, not just guys that do the blood and the guts. He needs wrestlers too, you know, guys like the franchise Shane Douglas and others, you know, so he explained to me that, you know, we do the extreme stuff, but we also have, you know, great wrestling. We have great cruiserweights. We need guys to, you know, so he made me feel comfortable. And I never was asked to do anything that I wouldn't have done on my own. It was kind of, and when I did it too, like when I started doing a little bit more like with the ladder matches and the barbed wire stuff, I realized a lot of it was more of a work. That's how great Paul was and the system was. And I don't like to kill the magic, but a lot of the ECW stuff was a work. And people didn't realize it because they bought into the extreme. That's how great those days were, because you could still sort of sell some of that stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was brilliant. So a lot of the stuff we did was a lot of it was worked. Fans just didn't know because they bought into, you know, a lot of the extreme stuff, which was great. You know, that's part of the wonder of the business, right? Is making them believe. And when I found my comfort zone, started working with Tommy Dreamer and Sabu, I was like, forget it, man. This is great. You know, it just gave me an extra level of more tools in my toolbox, so to speak, to use in a match.
And I suppose, PJ, at that time you're in the locker room, the dressing room at ECW.
Mm-hmm.
You're seeing matches going on. You're seeing wrestlers coming back into the dressing room. Was there a period in that time where you saw real bad injuries, real horrific injuries? People start to cut open, having coming out the come back to locker room after doing a match, and you're hearing an hour later they're in a hospital or something like that. Was there ever a scenarios like that, or in terms of maybe wrestlers going the extra mile to sell a product, and obviously things going awry and putting their own bodies in harm's way?
I mean, sure, there were situations where, you know, guys would get hurt or something would go, you know, wrong. But for the most part, other than that, there was one time where New Jack, I think it was 1999, at a pay-per-view, I think it was Guilty as Charged, where he fell off a scaffold with Vic Grimes, and it was, something, it was either a jump or something was mistimed, and Vic Grimes fell on him. That was a legitimate scary moment, because we had to, you know, we had to take it off the live feed and run a bunch of, you know, backstage promo stuff that we had already previously recorded. That was really concerning and frightening, even though he ended up being okay and things went on. There were a couple of scary moments, but nothing, believe it or not, it was, we never really did anything, especially in the later days, as I think more guys got smart and better workers, and doing less of that crazy stuff. I mean, the earlier days were more barbaric than when I got there. When I got there in 97, it was their second. I worked every single pay-per-view except for the first one. Other than that, I was on all their pay-per-views. I just missed the first one because I wasn't with the company yet. So the more we got experience, we were gaining experience, the more I think everybody started to say, hey, we need to protect one another. We could do some of the crazy stuff once in a while, but this is becoming, because back then it was just, hey, we're wrestling once a month, you know, so guys could come in, kill themselves, and they have a whole month to recover. The later years, we were on the road 3 days a week, sometimes 4 days a week, and doing TVs and pay-per-views. So you know, guys started to understand we need to stay healthy for ourselves and the company. You know, we have action figures now, we have video games now. So it was starting to become a brand thing, and guys started to smarten up and protected one another and themselves from injury and stuff like that, you know.
And I suppose, PJ, it's worth noting you had your first major title. You became a world champion in ECW in 1997. You went on a 2-month winning streak. But one of my sort of storylines that I remember as a teenager going back, and this is going back in the early to 2000s, the whole invasion cycle, and it captured the whole world's imagination, because probably outside of America at the time, in terms of TV viewing, most of the TV viewing in Europe and mainland Europe, the WWF had nearly all the market in terms of that. So in terms of the early 2000s, we had this scenario where we have all these WCW wrestlers coming on the scene at once. We have all these ECW wrestlers coming on the scene
Right.
at once. We had nearly over 100 wrestlers at one stage, and all the different sort of brands and sort of fighting for supremacy. At the
Yeah.
time, being involved in that sort of atmosphere, those sort of storylines, were they exciting, or because there were so many wrestlers, did it mean there was so limited time for wrestlers that you might get 1 week appearance and then you might be on again for another 2 or 3 weeks because they just had so many for a period of for those 4 or 5 months?
In a way, yes. Unfortunately, I feel that the whole invasion was mismanaged.
Okay.
And I'll explain as quickly as I can. But I was in the ring for the first sort of piece of that. I think it was the Dudley Boys against, I think, Raven and myself, or something like that. It was something where I'm probably wrong, but it was something where there are 4 ECW guys in the ring. And, and then somebody comes in like Taz or a Dreamer or somebody, and they think like it's going to be us fighting one another, or, and instead it's, I think Jericho was in the ring and Benoit was in the ring too. It's when ECW formed as a faction. Heyman came out. It was the first time the invasion started. And I remember that it was like the 9 o'clock hour when Raw was from 9 p.m. to 11. We did that angle, and Paul Heyman said, ECW is here. We're doing that, So ECW had formed. Huge pop we were in a football stadium, like 38,000 people. Huge pop, huge ECW. Fast forward 1 hour, then Shane McMahon and the whole thing comes down where he said now WCW and ECW are going to link up to form the alliance. So we had ECW forming to go against WWE, WCW as its own entity. That would have been the real invasion would have been if 3 companies, would have been WCW versus WWE versus ECW. And then by the end of the hour, it was WCW, ECW, the alliance against WWE, which killed it, because then you have so many guys, and really it was just a vehicle for Stone Cold to turn heel. So we all ended up, Lance Storm, myself, Tommy Dreamer, many others, Chavo Guerrero, I could go on and on, Rhino, RVD. We were just fodder we were just background guys for Stone Cold and his heel turn. And then you had, of course, like Booker T and Jericho in the mix. There were more prominent guys, but, ECW kind of got swallowed up by the invasion, and it diluted it, because if they would have left it where all 3 promotions were against maybe one another, and someday at WrestleMania, you have a Super Bowl of wrestling where you have all these dream matches, you know what I mean? And tried to keep the integrity of all the individual companies. I thought that where the money was. So then a lot of guys like myself, Tommy Dreamer, Rhino, we lost all that credibility, no pun intended, that we had earned in ECW to just become background guys for the alliance. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And PJ, you all sort of found yourself in the hardcore sort of division, and in that time, in terms of that, you were all sort of put on these sort of classic hardcore matches where you're fighting out in the snow, and I remember one they're fighting rivers and fighting river banks and fighting in all sort of backstories, and they sort of put a whole rake of characters into 20 or 30 characters into this hardcore division, and the title was changing grasp every weekend, every weekend, week out, and it almost became like that was a separate show in itself.
It was more of a joke, I thought. I mean, look, I'm a former 8-time hardcore champion. I would win the belt. I'd beat Billy Gunn and lose it to Raven in the same night, So, I mean, look, it was fun. It's very similar to the WWE 24/7 title is what the hardcore title was. That's where the idea came from. And it was something, I mean, look, it was more of a comedic thing. It was It was cool for what it was. Look, it was better to be on doing that than not be on at all. So, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I mentioned this to Carlos Colon. I asked him when he finished with the WWE, was there ever a possibility that he would go to TNA or the rival companies like that? And he said he thought about it, but in the terms he wanted to stay on the good books in terms of WWF and keep that
Right.
sort of friendship there in case another opportunity would come about in the
Sure.
future to come back again. Was that something you sort of thought about at the time as well, in terms of coming out of WWE, looking at other sort of rival sort of brands? Or I know you went on the independent circuit for a long time. Did you feel maybe traveling the world, independent circuit, getting out, was that you didn't want to get locked down into another franchise, an up and coming sort of business like TNA at the time or something like that?
Well, I mean, I certainly wanted to. I wasn't worried necessarily. I mean, WWE, they let me go in 2000, the beginning of 2003, I think January 2003. And right away, I went to All Japan Pro Wrestling. That was my first match outside of the WWE. So I went to All Japan, and then I went to the original when Jerry Jarrett and Jeff Jarrett started to run the original TNAs on Tuesdays. I was there and reunited my feud with Jerry Lynn. I did that for a couple of, I think 6 months we did that, but that really wasn't paying the bills, quite frankly. It wasn't as big as it was going to be later on. But then 2006 or 2005 happened, where I got a call from the WWE for the first ECW one night stand in 2005. And, you know, that's when my relationship with the WWE started back up again.
Okay.
So I was gone for like 2 years before I went back for ECW one night stand. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose, PJ, in terms of the wrestling industry, and I suppose we're starting 1990, we're talking around to 2000, we're talking maybe 20, 25 years or more in the industry as sort of such. Do you look maybe at the industry when you were in 90s and 2000s and the late 90s, early 2000s and say, listen, the industry was at its prime, it was a good time to be in the industry? Or you look at it now in terms of that, it's probably a 1 in a million sort of opportunity, and sort of things are predestined in terms of where it's going now. And maybe that the wrestling industry back in the 90s to 2000s, it had that sort of fan base, the early fan base in the 30s and the 40s. Now you're seeing that the young fan base, they might follow wrestling until they're 15 or 16, and then they probably go away from it in terms of it's reached its sort of peak or for them at that sort of stage. Do you feel sort of blessed in one sense that you were there when all the big hitters were there, Austin, Michael, Triple H, Rock, Undertaker, that probably in the sort of the glamour feeling around the world, it doesn't really have those sort of names attached to it as it once did?
Oh, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, I mean, it was there's a lot of reasons for this, but I'll start really quickly. We could, this is a whole separate podcast we could have on whys and whens, but I mean, if you think about it, you know, from Shawn Michaels to Bret Hart to the Razor Ramones and, you know, the NWO and all that stuff, The Rock, Steve Austin. I wrestled Steve Austin, you know, 10 times on house shows right before, when he was with the $1 Million Man still, you know, and he was the ringmaster, and started to hear the people coming up to, you know, when he was almost stone cold, you know, you could hear the fans really starting to get with them, and the ascension of The Rock and all this great stuff. Even Triple H, wrestling Hunter when he first got there. I wrestled Hunter before, you know, when he was still doing the bow, before he became DX Hunter. And I think the reason that those times were so great was, it spawned from the territory days. It's when wrestling stars were still wrestling stars. I don't know why it's this way, but I think it's the lack of it doesn't necessarily have to be anymore, because AEW is a real force to be reckoned with. But I think when WWE was the only company in town, we lost that feeling of, you know, because when the Monday Night Wars were happening, anybody could show up at any time. You had the NWO happening. You had guys jumping ship all the time. It was exciting, right? You had to watch Raw or Nitro because you never knew. And that was what was so exciting with the fans. So now I think things were, for a long time, being that there was no competition, I think it was just business as usual. WWE has those certain guys. That's why they keep going to the past, bringing old talent up, is because WWE, quite frankly, hasn't done a good enough job of making fresh superstars and making people kind of, I don't know, it's we could analyze it to death, but I just think it was lack of competition. Now I hope with AEW being well under I think we're going on 2.5, it's going to be 2.5 years at the end of the year, but of being on TNT, it would matter if Kenny Omega showed up on Raw. It would be a big deal. Yeah. And it would be a big deal if, another WWE guy that's hot coming from, WWE to AEW. I think that's hopefully what will bring wrestling, that excitement back, because we can't keep asking, how many more matches do the older guys have? Even Edge, who looks great and has done a great job. I'm 47. Edge is probably 48, 47, 48. How many more matches does he have? How many more matches does Brock have? Certainly Undertaker's all done. It's like, we can't keep relying on we need to bring those next generations up. Now it's a question of how do we do it? So I think having other companies around that are equal, or at least in the ballpark, have another primetime show like AEW, hopefully we can get that interest up again, But I think it comes down to the wrestling too. I think we have gotten so we sugarcoat so much. It's so safe and PG. I don't think anybody wants to see that. I think people miss those good old days of just F it and go for it, say some stuff that, God, we watch so much bad stuff on television with cussing and violence. Let's go start doing some more some riskier content that, maybe brings back, those college kids, those 21-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 27-year-olds, that age group that's willing to spend the money. And the pandemic certainly hasn't helped, so I could tell you by knowing that I did a show recently in Baltimore, Maryland, and it was sold out instantly because fans are just dying to come back. And I hope, being away with this pandemic for so long, when touring gets back for the major companies and the independents as well, that fans will really dive in, and start to support again, because the business really is at an interesting point. But there's a lot of positive stuff going on too. So hopefully we can have another. Usually the big resurgence, like the big pops in the business happened. Like it was the Hogan era, and then there was some time off, and then it was the Monday Night Wars, and that now it's fizzled out. So, we're a long time coming for another resurrection of the business. And I think we're just kicking it off. I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see some amazing stuff from a whole new bunch of characters that we don't even know exist yet. I think it's an exciting time.
A penultimate question, second last question, and I suppose you don't have to answer this question now if you don't want to.
That's okay.
I suppose you were around in the 90s, the 2000s, and I suppose wrestling was hit with two worldwide sort of tragedies at that time. Eddie Guerrero's passing, sudden passing, which was a shock to everyone, and then obviously a year afterwards, the Chris Benoit sort of tragedy, sort of such as well. As a wrestler in the dressing room, as sort of fellow people coming to work today, how did that hit you and hit all the wrestlers? Were you absolutely gobsmacked? Obviously, first of all, you had to deal with the Eddie tragedy, and no sooner did you deal with that than a sort of bigger tragedy, a whole wider scale. And it was almost like your industry, it probably set you back in terms of like, how does wrestling recover from such devastation in such a short sort of time? And I suppose you probably were in the ring with those lads several times and started your career as such. did it rock you and the industry right to the core, up to Vince McMahon, all the way down? What happened in terms of those? Because when you think of tragedies in wrestling, you think of Owen Hart, Eddie Guerrero, and Chris
Yeah.
Benoit. They're the three, and obviously Owen's was a freak accident, but
Right.
Eddie's and Chris, when they came along, really sort of shook the world, really, in terms of
Yeah.
drugs and in terms
Yeah.
of, yeah.
I mean, absolutely. Both. I mean, I was in the ring with both of them. I remember vividly, actually. I could remember where I was, where I was traveling with Shawn Michaels and X-Pac and Hunter. And for some reason, my flight got delayed. So I had to travel with the only guys at the airport were Chris and Eddie. They were traveling together. So I asked him, I was like, look, man, you know, Shawn and those guys, they had to go. Do you mind if I come with you? So I went on this whole, you know, weekend with them because they were very close and great guys. You know, I mean, Chris held my youngest son in his hands when he was a baby. Wonderful guy, you know, been in the ring with both of them. Eddie was a tragedy, but the biggest tragedy for me with Eddie was he had gotten clean and sober for a long time. When he passed, there was nothing really in his system from what I remember in the coroner's reports. I think it was the damage from all the years of abuse that had finally caught up with them. But nonetheless, at 38 years old, at the peak of his career, especially creatively, he was over. You know, that was, you know, and he was such a lovable, everybody loved Eddie. You know, the Guerrero family was very highly regarded, still is very highly regarded, but Eddie was just a wonderful human being. So that hurt that way, you know, especially to see him fight so hard to get back and to be sober and to be doing the right thing. You know, that's what was very sad. But the Chris and Nancy thing was, I mean, who can imagine?
Yeah.
I mean, these are people that, like I said, Chris held my son. Nancy was friends with my wife. They, you know, she changed my son's diapers, you know, at WrestleMania 17 at, you know, when they were at the airport. Such good people. You just never know, man. Who could have ever even fathomed that? You know what I mean? That's something that I'll never understand. Not that you know, I don't even know what really happened. I mean, I've seen documentaries and stuff, and you know, obviously we know what happened. But I'm just saying, in the mind, you know, I don't know what Chris is going through, was going through at that time. All I do know is that, and I could claim, you know, from my position, the speculation is a lot of brain trauma from concussions did not help. And I've had multiple, I mean, over a dozen concussions. And I could tell you that it has largely impacted my quality of life. And also at times, if I drink alcohol or something like that, there's a part of my brain that's just not wired right because of the concussions. Do I think that played a part in the tragedy? Yes, I do. I certainly think it was a lot of the brain injuries, and if you look at the reports, it says how damaged Chris's brain really was, and he had no place to be wrestling at that time in his life. But also, you know, you don't know what's going on in someone's life, you know, behind the scenes. You know, nobody, you know, you don't know when I go to work, or you know how it is, if you're fighting with your wife, or what the situation really is at home. So there's just a lot of things that I think shocked us and made us realize that, you know, because in wrestling you can never really sell, right? You would be looked down upon. What I mean by sell is, if I'm having emotional problems, right? If I'm having trouble at home, you're supposed to just suck it up, be a man, be tough, you know, whatever. And unfortunately, with mental health, with injuries of the brain, anything of that nature, I think needs awareness. And I don't think, you know, because if I would to go and call Vince or call anybody in the office and complain about my mental health or stuff that I'm sure was happening to Chris at the time, you would be looked upon as a weak person, as a pussy, as people would call it. You know, you're just do, you know, be a man, toughen up. And I think that stigma was around for a long time, and I don't think it is anymore. I think they've done a lot of good things to combat it and to correct it, but in those days it was very real, And I think that all of it, the pressures, the brain damage, maybe the drugs, for Chris, really, that it was, I shouldn't even talk because I really don't know the facts, but it was just from my perspective and how I knew these gentlemen, is the last thing I would have expected from such a kind person on the outside, from what I could have seen.
I suppose, PJ, the last question I'll put it to you now. Just incredible, I suppose, an incredible sort of career. If you could sum it up in terms of the last 25 years or more, 30 years or more, if you could sum it up into 2 sentences in terms of what wrestling has meant for you, what would you say in terms of that, and would you do it all over again?
It was the greatest adventure of my life. I lived my dreams, and I would do it all over again. Absolutely. Differently. I would do it differently, but I would do it all over again. Absolutely.
PJ Polaco, an absolute pleasure talking to you this evening.
Thank you, sir.
Relive your memories of your time in ECW, WWF. Over 25 years in the business, a world champion in his time in ECW. As you mentioned, you fought everyone from Hulk Hogan to The Rock to Stone Cold. You were there for all the glory years. Hopefully, you're still wrestling even to this day, putting on the independent sort of shows. PJ, an absolute pleasure, mate. And hopefully, please God, when everything is back to normal, we'll get to see you in big crowds, and we'll get to see one more ECW sort of revival on our screens very near future again. But for the moment, PJ Polaco, an absolute pleasure, and take care, mate.
Thank you so much, man. Have a wonderful day. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.